if we were pursuing a really optimal policy now, we would be doing more right now to help people get back to work. The federal government would be continuing to provide assistance in healthcare and education to beleaguered state and local governments so they don't have to cut so much. And we would be, if we could, enacting legislation to deal with our longer-term fiscal problems, but designing it so no budget cuts were taking effect until after the economy and jobs were back. But that's not what we're doing. Where we are now, there will be no further stimulus, there will be no further relief for state and local governments coming out of Washington. Instead, we're starting to cut right now. In the 3 decades after World War II, we had shared prosperity in the country. Total income went up this much, and the average income for the bottom 90% was about the same. But if you look at the period from 1976 to the present, here's the increase in total income on an average over everybody. Hardly any increase for the bottom 90%. Huge increase at the top. You would think this should give you some context for how to think about what we're going to do about the deficit. And the next slide is about the poorest children in the country, those who live not below the poverty line, but below half of the poverty line. In 1995, there were 9.2 million children whose incomes were below half the poverty line before government benefit programs based on income, food stamps, the earned income credit, cash assistance, things of this sort. Before they were taken into effect, there were 9.2 million children living below half the poverty line. And after the federal programs and state programs operated, 1.4 million were. In other words, about 7.8 million children were lifted from below half the poverty line to above it. Many of them were still poor. They were between half the poverty line and the poverty line. But at least they weren't in the very bottom. Now here we get to 2005. Just based on the private economy, before we take government low-income benefit programs into account, there were 6.2 million children below half the poverty line. 3 million fewer than in 95. But after all was said and done, there were 1 million more. 2.4. Why? Because the government programs lifted many, many fewer children out of deep poverty in 2005 than they had in 1995. So this is kind of a little context. And now we get to the current budget battle. So as you all know, I'm sure, all over the news, are these stories that the House Republicans passed a bill that, depending on which starting point you use, cuts 61 billion or 100 billion. This is the bill about how much funding will the various government agencies and all of the programs that aren't entitlements, Head Start, much of child care, the Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program, many others, many of the program, education, many of the programs CDF works on. How much funding will they get for the rest of the fiscal year that we're now in that runs through September 30th? Now, not to get into a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff, but the dynamics here are neither party wants to be responsible for a government shutdown. You have to pass a bill to keep the government open and fund it to avoid a shutdown. The House Republicans can pass such a bill every 2 weeks or whenever they want. They just put all these cuts in it. The Republicans in the House and the Senate are saying, where's the Senate's alternative bill? Well, we're just going to keep passing our bills until the Senate passes its own bill. Well, the Senate can't pass any bill because in the Senate, there are 100 senators, but you need 60 votes, not 51, to pass virtually anything. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, has said he will make sure there are not 60 votes for any bill that funds the government for the rest of this year unless that bill contains as deep cuts as the House passed. They don't have to be exactly the same dollars and the same programs, but the total has to be the same. So there's nothing that gets 60 votes in the Senate. And so every couple of weeks, the House passes a bill, and it's take our cuts for the next 2 weeks, or you're responsible for shutting the government down because you, the Senate, which is controlled by the Democrats, although they don't have 60, they have 53, you haven't passed anything, so if you don't take our bill, it's your fault. Now, by April, the stakes are going to rise. They're going to rise because we're going to get to the end of the next 3-week period, and we'll be getting to the point where if they keep passing a bill for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, the cuts are going to start to get more and more severe that go in it.